Joining me now is Christopher Vandome, a senior research fellow at Chatham House Africa, as we continue to monitor the situation in Mozambique. Christopher, a very good afternoon to you. Thanks very much for your time. Well, we have the opposition saying the election was rigged, and these protests are going to continue until they are satisfied with whatever outcome, the details of which, of course, none of us know at this stage. But on the other hand, you have Frelimo saying it was a free and fair process. What's happening now is people who are not satisfied with a very legitimate outcome, influenced, they say, by external interests.
Yeah, look, I think that what we're seeing here is a very complicated situation where, if you look at the responses of international observers of the election, the European Union have pointed out some of the irregularities that were taking place. But SADC itself, the SADC mission's initial statement demonstrated that, as far as they were concerned, these were peaceful, well-run, and reflected the will of the people. And so we've got a very complicated situation now for SADC itself to try and have to deal with. And the current SADC chairperson, President Mnangagwa in Zimbabwe, has already congratulated Frelimo and President Chapo for electoral victory. And so in terms of the region and international actors to be able to handle this situation, it's very complicated because they've essentially accepted the result, which is now being contested by the opposition. And so it leaves them with very few avenues to follow in terms of being able to exert regional pressure. And we do have an extraordinary summit being held in Harare next week to deal with this. And it looks likely that a lot of the attention from the region is going to be around the reopening of transport corridors, as we've heard in your piece just previously, as well as I think there'll be a regional attention on Mozambicans leaving the country and going to other countries in the region. And so there'll be a human movement part of this as well.
The thing is, we have seen this movie playing itself out, I mean, before, whether it's in Zimbabwe or Zambia, now Mozambique, where you have the foreign observers pointing to irregularities that they may have seen, and then questioning whether elections would be free and fair. And SADC, for its part, and usually the AU as well, would then come and say, no, from where we sit, the election was free and fair. And we've seen this happening numerous times. And what we're seeing in Mozambique now is really not much different from what we've seen before.
Yeah, look, you're right. Now, there are some interesting examples of where SADC has been a little bit more forceful, and it's down to individuals rather than down to the institution itself. And so, for example, the previous election in Zimbabwe, there was the SADC mission under the leadership of Nevers Mumba from Zambia that took for the first time quite a forceful line on the election in Zimbabwe and called into question some of that process. And that was really instrumental. Now, we've also seen in places like Malawi in Southern Africa, also a SADC member, where international observers have signed off on an election. And there were the 2019 election in Malawi. International observers did point to some of the problems that were there, but essentially said, okay, this result will stand. Then got challenged within the domestic court system and overturned. And so, we've got this mixed picture where we've got, on the one hand, individual examples led by individuals where SADC has been a little bit more forceful, but it's not a consistent thing across the region. And we've got examples where international observers have essentially allowed a result to play out that then has been challenged domestically. And I think SADC as an institution has been very incapable of dealing with the complexity of what's going on within the democratic space in Southern Africa and being able to deal with these differences. Now, this is going to be really important, particularly kind of going onwards from this year, because we've seen two really important democratic changes within Southern Africa in the last 6 months. We've seen the formation of the Government of National Unity in South Africa, and we've seen the transfer of political power away from the BDP in Botswana, and the inauguration today, in fact, of President Duma Boko. And so what has been a relatively stable in terms of the parties that are in power region for the past 25 years, since the transition to democracy in South Africa itself. A lot of these parties have remained the same. There's been instances in Zambia and Malawi of party transition. Now we're seeing it in countries that are big SADC members, are important SADC members, like South Africa, like Botswana, where SADC is itself based in Gaborone and its headquarters in Gaborone. And we're starting to see a split in the way in which in the direction and trajectories of some of these Southern African democracies. And this is going to be really challenging for SADC as an organization to be able to maintain this consistency and position that it's had, especially now when at the SADC Leaders Summit, for example, that's going to take place this week. In the case of Duma Boko, you've got a new president who's just taken over and comes from an opposition background. And so you're starting to see these figures also now take a seat at the top table.
Do you think that necessarily, with time, these complexities, as you call them, would become less complex given what has just happened in Botswana, what happened not altogether in South Africa on the May 29 election, given how diluted the power of the ANC is currently, what happened in Zambia. Do you think that all these instances are going to, perhaps slowly, maybe painfully, but with time, they will change what we have become accustomed to by way of how SADC has been running its affairs?
I think to an extent, yes. And I think that up until this point, the big hitters and the big leaders within SADC have all come from dominant parties, most of them national liberation movements. But in the case of the BDP in Botswana, for example, not really a national liberation movement, but was a dominant party. So you've had leaders who have been who are leaders of parties who have been in power for a very long time as the big forces within SADC as a bloc. And so the culture has been one of stability, and particularly party stability. Like I said, in places like Malawi and Zambia, there have been these transitions of power between different parties. But certainly across the bigger countries and the more powerful countries in the southern part of the region, there's been that consistency. Now we're seeing the ANC in a position of a government of national unity. It looks very unlikely that the ANC will ever. It may increase its vote share going forward, but it looks very unlikely that it would ever be back above the 50% mark. We've seen change in Botswana. We've got an election coming up in Namibia later on this year that could also be we could see a squeezing of the ruling party there as well. And so the culture of SADC itself is we're going to see a change. We're going to see more voices within that space who come from parties that have traditionally been in opposition. We're going to see more voices who come from parties who are now having to share power. And so this organization that has traditionally had to been this club of long-standing parties in power is now going to look a little bit different. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got parties such as ZANU-PF, parties such as Frelimo, parties such as the MPLA, who look much more entrenched in many ways within how they are maintaining that power. And so within that leadership cluster, it looks like this might start pulling in slightly different directions and particularly around electoral standards in Southern Africa. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out and how the forces of SADC and whether SADC as an institution is able to contain these different voices and progress and move on and try and maintain be a positive force for democratization in Southern Africa.